With violence on the rise in our schools, in our cities, in our country, and even on the world stage, I often get asked, how do you resolve conflict without violence? You know, if you've been feeling despair by violence on the rise and are wondering, is it even possible in this moment to resolve our differences without the use of force and without the use of violence? Then I want to urge you to stay tuned because this is a video of hope. In this video, I'm going to share some research in the world of brain science and psychology on why a dispute often escalates into something called a conflict spiral. But importantly, I'm then going to offer 4 specific steps you can take to de-escalate conflict and to resolve it peacefully. Let me talk about why conflict can often escalate to the point of violence. Now, there's a lot of research on this, so I don't pretend to tell you everything, but I want to share 2 specific things in particular. One is a dynamic that has been termed the accuser-excuser bias. So the name of this bias was coined by Keith Allred, who for many years taught at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and who now runs the National Institute for Civil Discourse. So what is the accuser-excuser bias? So here is what happens. As human beings, we have these 2 biases that together can lead to a conflict spiral. So let's imagine that I do something that is experienced by my friend Letitia as harmful. So in that moment, Letitia has to make a decision. She either makes this decision that Bob made a mistake, he didn't mean to do that, or that Bob intended to cause the harm. Because of something called the accuser bias, Letitia is more inclined to decide, Bob meant it. He intended that, right? That's the accuser bias. Now, as soon as Letitia makes that decision, she then experiences anger toward me. Before she makes the decision, she might not be happy that I harmed her, but she's not feeling angry toward me. It is the anger that then causes her to do something in retaliation, something to harm me. Now, I suffer from the excuser bias. I say something like, Letitia, I didn't mean anything by that. What are you doing? But boy, you meant what you just did, the accuser bias. So then I feel angry toward her and I counter-retaliate. And then she experiences that as intentional. And now we are in a conflict spiral. And so what the research has suggested is that human beings tend to over-assume the negative intentionality when they are harmed. And then that causes this anger and sets up a retaliation that causes a counter-retaliation, and this gets out of control, right? And this can happen in a family, it can happen in the community, it can happen at a national level. As a pure Darwinian bias, there's something to be said about this, right? Because imagine thousands of years ago, I'm walking in the woods, I bump into you. I have to decide, did you mean that or not? If I decide you meant it, and I'm wrong, I still turn around, I take out my bat, I club you to death, and you're dead and I'm alive. If I decide you didn't mean it, and I'm wrong, you turn around and club me to death, and I'm dead and you're alive, right? As a Darwinian survival bias, this makes a lot of sense. But unfortunately, in our modern era, most of our conflicts are not at that existential level, and so the accuser-excuser bias gets us stuck. The second challenge from a research perspective that we have is something called an emotional refractory period, which is that when we're in a conflict situation, we have this tendency that when we are triggered, even though our mind has this conscious level, right, we're making these intentional and smart decisions every day, there's a second level of our mind, the unconscious level, that is triggered and releases a bunch of chemicals. It releases things like cortisol and adrenaline, and we could feel our heart rate go up, and sometimes we could feel sweaty or sometimes really cold, right? We know these moments. In that moment, our cognitions are overwhelmed with this refractory reaction. And it's during this time when we tend to do the dumb things that escalate, like we get defensive, or like we say, "You're so stupid," or "You're such a jerk." How do we handle this? So I want to offer 4 key steps. The first one, right, sounds really easy, but it is really hard to do. And it is when you are in that moment of the emotional refractory period, which can last between like 5 and 20 minutes for many of us, it's important to do no harm. Easy to say, hard to do. It's like the moment you get the email that's sent to you and all your colleagues that says something that is really irritating, like, "Bob, we are still waiting on your part of the report," and you want to hit reply all and then give the person who wrote it a piece of your mind, that's the moment you want to do no harm. So what research has suggested is that one way to do that, right, is to name the emotion to yourself, to tame it, or to practice mindfulness, to become more aware of what you're feeling. Second, and this really addresses the accuser-excuser bias, and it's working to separate impact from intentions. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you remember in the accuser-excuser bias, right, the impact is we feel harmed or we feel threatened. That's real and we should own that. But what we want to do is hold back from making the intentionality. So I can share the impact, but I don't know what the intention is. I can ask about that. I can inquire about that. And this move, right, can make a very, very big difference. So I'm going to tell a story harkening back now more than 50 years ago to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I know some of you probably remember this. Most of us probably do not. During the Kennedy administration, the Soviet Union installed missiles in Cuba. And these missiles clearly posed a threat to the security of the United States. And the Kennedy cabinet spent an enormous amount of time debating what to do. And most of the Joint Chiefs, most of the military officials, were making all sorts of recommendations for an American invasion of Cuba. But it was one person, right, it was John F. Kennedy, who held back and said, "But if we do that, what will the Soviets do?" And moreover, right, he really wanted to get everyone to think about, was this an offensive move from the Soviet Union against the United States, or rather, was it perhaps a more defensive move because recently the United States had placed similar missiles in Turkey, also close to the Soviet Union. So that holding back and separating the impact, right, we feel threatened, from the possible intentions, opened up space for a negotiated resolution that really perhaps prevented the world from ending up in nuclear annihilation. Third, in that moment in a conflict, when you want to fight back, when you want to escalate, do whatever you can to engage some listening skills. So asking questions, acknowledging strong emotions, right? We talk about de-escalation. De-escalation training is really important now for criminal justice professionals and police and teachers in schools. So what de-escalation is, it's a bunch of different things, but one of them is really good active listening. Digging into the emotions, acknowledging the emotions, acknowledging the strongly felt feelings, and then asking questions instead of ignoring them or fighting back. Lastly, when you find yourself in a conflict where it's really easy to respond with an immediate reaction, I want to invite you to expand the time frame and put yourself into their shoes. So one of the questions, right, I always ask if I'm working with a client or mediating in a moment when the other side wants to retaliate, I always say, well, what is your purpose here? And they'll say, well, my purpose is to show them that they can't get away with this. So your purpose is to persuade them to stop doing this. Yes. Let me ask, if you retaliate, if you were sitting on the other side of the retaliation, how would you respond? And almost always they'll say something like, well, I would be defensive, or I would tell them why they're wrong, or I would work to get even. Okay, like if that's what you would do, then why do you think they're going to do anything else? Oh, yeah, that's right. So, really good conflict resolvers expand the time frame and are purposeful with their moves. Because it's really easy to be short term. You did something that hurt me, so now I'm going to do something that hurt you. Oh, now that escalates and escalates, right? And it becomes a contest of will and can quickly escalate to violence. And we see that happening, I think, in our politics right now in the United States, where each side digs in and it escalates. Oftentimes, we're not at the level of violence, but we're getting closer and closer, and sometimes violence has erupted. But if I expand the time frame and I say my purpose here is to actually try to de-escalate this, to influence their behavior, and to influence their behavior not just in the next move, but in the next move, and the next move, and the next move, I have a greater likelihood of, instead of creating a conflict spiral, moving it toward de-escalation. So to sum up, when you find yourself in a conflict situation and you want to try to avoid violence and bring the conflict to a better resolution, consider these 4 steps. First, do no harm. Remember the emotional refractory period and do what you can to be purposeful and constructive in those moments of extreme emotional agitation. 2, separate impact from intentions. Even when the impact is harmful, it doesn't mean their intentions were. Spend time trying to understand what their intentions are. 3, instead of fighting fire with fire, listen actively. Engage de-escalation moves. And 4, to avoid an act-react cycle, expand the time frame and put yourself into their shoes. Truth of the matter is, every time violence is used as a way to resolve conflict, it is a failure of our empathy. It is a failure of our ability to perspective take. It is a failure of our ability to put our best skills and talents to work to bring about a more peaceful world. Each of us can learn the skills to do that better. And if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to think about taking a class on conflict resolution or negotiation. I offer them through the Cambridge Negotiation Institute, but there are many, many fine classes that you could also take as well. If you want to learn more about how to improve as a negotiator, watch this next video, which is what is the most important negotiation skill? And a little tip, it's something I talked about in this video. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and ring the bell. Thanks for watching. I'm Bob Bordone. Okay, you know you want to know the secret negotiation skill. Keep watching.